All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live to discuss one more, or my final, wellness topic for the year 2017. Hope you've all had a good 2017. I hope that in some way, shape, or form, listening to these talks has helped you in some way, shape, or form. So today, I think it's important we talk about perhaps one of the more common emotional experiences we all have, which is depression. And I think some definitions will help a lot with this, because I think we have a general sense of what depression is, but I don't think we quite fully understand the different kinds of depression we can experience and all the stats related to depression and, how that happens and how that works. So I want to try and explain kind of real basically what is depression in the first place. And then I want to describe what the research says in terms of the causes of depression, depending upon what kind of depression it is. And then finally, I want to talk real briefly, as always, about the brain, because, the more we understand about how we work, the greater sense of agency we have in making better choices with regard to our wellness needs, like lifestyle and diet and sleep and all that good stuff. So if I can explain what areas of the brain are affected with depression, maybe we can make some better decisions about different things that affect our brain, which might affect our propensity to develop depression. So first and foremost, what is depression, right? So we all know what it's like to feel sad. We all know what it's like to have low mood or have an experience of, just being kind of down. And we might consider that depression. We might be in a depressive state, if you want to call it that. But I don't think that accurately describes the wide array of kind of sad experiences we have. As you know, I did a talk earlier this year on grieving, and that can feel like depression. It can seem a lot like depression, right? You could even have some kind of grieving disorder where your depressive experiences from the loss of whatever it was are still affecting you in a severe way. So if you take a look at the diagnostic Bible for my profession, the DSM-5, there are different types of depressive experiences listed in there that you can diagnose someone with. So you can have major depressive disorder, you can have postpartum depression, you can have what used to be called dysthymia, is now called persistent depressive disorder. You can be diagnosed with bipolar disorder with major depressive episode. You can be diagnosed with seasonal affective disorder. There are all these different kind of diagnoses that center around depression in some way, shape, or form. And they're all kind of dependent upon whether or not you've experienced what we call a major depressive episode, which is 2 or more weeks of 5+ symptoms of depression related to sleeping and eating and low mood and self-esteem and suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior and all sorts of stuff like that. Low energy. So depending upon what kind of depressive experience you're having, you can get a different kind of diagnosis. However, I think the average person walking around living their daily life is going to have a variety of incidents throughout a day or a week where they have kind of low mood. It might last for a couple of days, it might last for a day, it might last for a week. That's not technically something that you would be diagnosed with if you went to some kind of clinic or saw a therapist, but it's still a very important phenomenon when we feel sad. And the question is, what do we do with that sadness, right? So I think we can come up with a kind of a definition, a nice colloquial definition of depression is any set of collective experiences of low mood that generally make us feel sad, right? It may not have kind of the intense grieving quality of sadness that we experience when we lose someone or we get fired or something, but it's still technically kind of a depressive experience. And I think we could, spend some time and get lost in, where does the word depression come from and all that good stuff. But I don't think that serves anyone at this point. But it might be good to know kind of the Latin and Greek origins of that word. If you're interested, take a look. So where does depression come from? So I've already mentioned that, in the different diagnoses we can have. We can have postpartum depression, we can have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, we can have dysthymia or bipolar or seasonal affective disorder. Even in the names of those disorders themselves, there's some kind of hint as to the thing that's triggering the depression. So with postpartum depression, the mother will have a child, and something about the chemical imbalance after having a child will cause depression, right? There's something psychological and there's something chemical that's making that happen. Or with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, I think it's still called that. And this is basically the hormone cycle that females go through. And for some subset of the population, affects their mood and their mental health to the point where the chemical process gets all out of whack and they get really depressed prior to going through their period. Sounds wonderful, right? Same thing with seasonal affective disorder. Some people, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but some people are more likely to have a low mood or depressive experience whenever they go into typically winter. I think it's usually around winter or kind of fall seasons when it's a little grayer outside, and that triggers something in their brain to cause them to be particularly sad and maybe even have a diagnosable condition. So as you can tell just from the names of these diagnoses, there are kind of two categories of etiology or why we get depressed. There are kind of psychosocial triggers or reasons, and then there are kind of biochemical triggers. So the research, I've got, let's see here, I've got 18 or so articles here I went through that show some of the reasons why we believe depression happens, especially a diagnosable kind of depression like major depressive disorder. So the basic working theory from the biochemical or the neurochemical perspective is basically that there's a certain percentage of the population, especially those diagnosed with major depression, have this genetic predisposition to have kind of deficits in their serotonin system, their dopamine system, and or their norepinephrine system. And that can be because of like having a problem with the short allele of one of your 5-HT transporters. There's a variety of different neurochemical, problems that can happen that are passed down genetically. So there's a genetic component to some depressive disorders. It's not perfectly genetic, and almost nothing is when it comes to mental health, but there's some genetics there. And the other thing that the research generally shows is that there are a variety of environmental triggers or disturbances that can mess with the brain or activate these genetic predispositions. So like I said, with seasonal affective disorder, for some reason the lack of sunlight does something to trigger this issue with neurochemistry in terms of your dopamine, your norepinephrine systems, and your serotonin systems. There's a lot of research right now around the area of sleep and depression and kind of the cyclical relationship between sleep and depression. If you don't get enough sleep or if you get too much sleep, that can cause depression, which is kind of a weird general finding in the science. So things are changing. So even how we think and how we're conditioned to think. So from the moment we're born to the moment we die, all of our psychological and social experiences are shaping each other, kind of back and forth in a relationship. So if you grow up in an environment where there's a lot of pessimistic thinking, that will shape your cognitive experience, help you develop biases that will kind of like exclude positive information when you're experiencing life, talking with people, etc., to the point where you can feel depressed, right? If you've been, taken advantage of or abused, you might also develop some low self-esteem or depression as a result of that as well. Because again, our mind, how we perceive the world and understand the world, reciprocally influences our brain chemistry and how we function. So there's this kind of nice reciprocal relationship between our environment, our experience, and how our mind functions. And all three keep playing with each other all day, every day. So you've all experienced this thing where you're stuck in traffic or you're late for work or you have a fight with someone and you feel kind of down. That's just normal. That's part of kind of the normal perspective, I would say, the statistically normal perspective on depression, where we're supposed to have low mood when sad things, disconnecting things happen to us, right? So in terms of why we get depressed, there's this weird mixture of biological, psychological, and social issues. And there's no perfect explanation. You know, in the early 2000s, a lot of the psychiatry world and the medical world thought it was a really big genetic issue. And there is a high heritability, as in it can be passed down from generation to generation, your sensitivity to depressive experiences. But it's not perfectly, you're going to be depressed if your mother had major depression. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist that way. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. So that's basically how we get depressed. There's environmental influences, and then there's genetics, and then there's our psychology. And then we come to, you know, what does the research say about depression in the first place? And, you know, how does it present? How does it show up? What's it look like? What are the stats? All that good stuff. So, not surprisingly, just like a lot of topics I've discussed over the course of my time with you guys, a lot of these contextual variables like culture and age and sex and race and all this good stuff affects who gets depressed to some degree or another. You know, if you take a look at the general kind of wide swath of the research on its face, you know, youth and older adults are more likely to struggle with depressive experiences than people in midlife. So from about, you know, 25 to 40, you're less likely to have a major depressive episode, just generally speaking. That's just an age fact, especially in Western culture. Now, in Eastern cultures, that's not as true. And I think there are different stats depending upon how you're defining depression. So for the purposes of talking about this research, it's just, you know, we're talking about really diagnosable depressive experiences. We're not talking about, okay, I had a bad day at work, so I feel sad. Now, it's not the same thing as having a major depressive episode or being diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder, for instance. So in terms of treatments for depression, there's a lot to say, but before I go there, I want to make sure that I talk about just the stats. So depending upon who you read, whether you read the CDC or the World Health Organization or NIH or NIMH, they put the kind of the prevalence, like the number of people that will be depressed in a given year, you know, clinically. It's something right around like 6.2%, 6.2 to 6.9%. So, you know, not a great majority of people will be diagnosed in a given year. Now, the World Health Organization says that, you know, the prevalence of major depression is something around 4%. So for some reason here in the US or in Western culture, we're more likely to be depressed. So that's something to think about. And in terms of the research, the lifetime prevalence, like the overall number of people that will have a major depressive experience, is something like 15% of the population in general, which is important because, again, we're looking at over 10%. We're looking at not a small number of people, right? So the roughly 7 billion people in the world, 10% of that is like, you know, 700 million. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people struggling with, you know, thoughts of harming themselves or more. So if it's 15%, that's even more. So we're looking at a lot of people who struggle over the course of their life. And we need to keep in mind what these people need. And when I get to talk about treatments, we can have a more nuanced discussion there. So when we talk about just what's the trend, are more people getting depressed? Are less people getting depressed? Has it always been 6.2%, et cetera, et cetera? What we find here in the US is that the number of people that are diagnosable with a depressive disorder is actually going up. From 2005 to 2015, I found a study that shows that the rate of increases is not slowing down. It's actually speeding up with regard to youth, so people under the age of 18, and people in the older adults, 65 and older category. And there's some theories as to why, but as of right now, let's just talk about the fact that the rate's going up. I think it's important to understand that as we get busier as a culture, as we learn more, as we have cooler technology, all this good stuff, life is speeding up, and we're having less connection and less meaning, which is one of the things that I talk about in my book, The Fear Problem, coming out soon, trust me, in January. And this lack of connection is going to naturally depress anyone. Again, we are biologically designed to want to feel close to people and feel connected to people. And when there's an absence of people, our panic and grief system will go off. We will be sad when we're disconnected. So I think the mass influx of people into our lives via social media and population growth and all that good stuff is leaving us with less close relationships. And I think among youth and older adults, things are dramatically different for both of those categories of people. And that's probably why, in terms of, if you look at older adults, they were from a certain kind of culture, certain small, kind of close culture that has now become more and more distanced, more and more busy, less sincere, and that's a problem. And I think that would reasonably depress a lot of older adults. And the fact that there are so many, and so many are dying so quickly from very horrible diseases like Alzheimer's disease and whatnot, I think in that and of itself is also depressing. So just want to plant that flag there that the prevalence is going up in the US. And I think that probably checks out with other Western cultures too. So what does the literature say about treatment, right? So there's been this stupid, long-standing debate in the psychology and medicine world where psychology fights with medicine because both want to be in charge of not only funding sources, but also just have kind of their authority. This is a long-standing war between psychiatry in particular and psychology. And there's all this research that's been done by a journal at the American Medical Association, and just lots of good stuff, lots of really good research for the last, I'd say, at least 30 years. It's really solid that talks about kind of what's the most effective treatment. And what we're finding is that if you do something like psychotherapy, you do cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive therapy or any number of types of depth-oriented therapies for depression, what we find, generally speaking in the literature, is that, psychological therapies are about as effective, if not more effective in some, circumstances, than medications. No, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know anything about the meds in a very deep and oriented way. So, you can read all the research yourself if you want. I'm going to post it here. But we know that meds are reasonably effective, but psychotherapy is also reasonably effective. What's also reasonably effective is changing your lifestyle, doing that wellness thing I always talk about. So, some studies show that with meds alone, you got, remission rates for clinical depressions around 30% after 6 months, whereas others, it's closer to 50%. So, again, if you're looking at chance or less than chance, that's probably not a good sign, which means there's probably something more than just the biochemical. You probably need to do something different with your lifestyle, with your relationships with people, to affect the way you live and the way you see the world, because meds are not going to change the way you see the world. That's important. And then the consequences of depression are great. A lot of people die because of suicidality. A lot of people have just less fulfilling lives because they're so depressed they can't get out of bed. All these things are just very tragic if you think about it. So there's a lot we can do beyond just therapy and meds. A lot of the research shows that mindfulness-based activities like MBSR and mindfulness meditations can help with managing depressive symptoms, especially managing the cognitive symptoms like self-esteem and rumination and things like that. Another treatment that's, again, really being pushed nowadays, especially for the last 3 or 4 years, is the whole alternative medicine treatment. So people are bringing club drugs like ketamine and ecstasy and forms of NMDA into the lab, and we're trying to see how effective they are. And what the general medical research shows is that they're starting to be kind of effective. However, we don't know a whole lot about long-term effects of using these medications on a consistent basis. And we don't know a whole lot about, side effects or if there's going to be good remission rates. So are we going to be free of depressive symptoms beyond a year if we do 2 or 3 months of kind of, LSD microdosing or ketamine or something like that? So they're still trying to figure that out. So be patient with the medical world, because they need to, for our sake, for our safety, really figure out if these drugs that seem so appealing actually work in a way that we'd like for them to work. As I mentioned earlier, there's a link between insomnia and depression. There's a link between how you're raised and what kind of chance of getting depression you have. So, for instance, there's a lot of research in the attachment world that shows that mothers with depression, both from birth and afterwards, can impact children in terms of developing psychopathology, getting sick, being anxious, having an insecure attachment style. So there's some research in the attachment world there that I think you all should look at some point. Again, attachment, as Dr. Dan Siegel said, is perhaps one of the most fundamental things. So if you don't want to mess up your kids, maybe you want to try and feel better first before having a kid. Finally, there's a lot of alternative seeming treatments that are being tried. So there are kind of supplement-based treatments that people are doing, like trying more vitamin C or vitamin E or something like that. There are other holistic treatments like massage and acupuncture that don't have as much research behind them but could be useful. Perhaps one of the most interesting things is what they call phototherapy or light therapy. So for people with seasonal affective disorder, what they find is if you give them what's called a light box, it's just literally a piece of plastic brick with a bunch of LED lights in it, and you have them sit in front of it for a predetermined period of time, it affects their neurochemistry and kind of provides the artificial sunlight that they're missing during the winter period, and it helps fight clinical seasonal affective disorder. So there are all these treatments you can try. So if you find yourself in therapy or having been diagnosed with any of these things, there are a lot of things you can do, and there's no reason to do just one thing because a bunch of things work. Now, how well they work is up for debate, but there's a lot that can work. And last but not least is, all the brain stuff. So the research on this is really kind of long-standing. We've been trying to figure out the neurobiological causes of depression for a long time and what happens when we're depressed to the brain. So there's a lot of research that just talks about, brain density. So what we find is people who are clinically depressed will have smaller kind of left hippocampus, so memory and memory integration areas of the brain. And we find that there's also an oversensitive kind of what we call HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this is the kind of freak out, lose your mind, get anxious part of your nervous system that allows you to get kind of overwhelmed with cortisol and things like that, so that we're prepared to move and fight off a problem. So what we find does with, that goes along with like Seligman's depression theory, is that when we get overwhelmed for long enough, eventually our brain gives up and we develop what's called learned helplessness. So the neurobiological kind of correlate of that theory is that our HPA is so overworked by life experiences that we kind of start to short ourselves out by being overly stimulated with cortisol, which shuts off the cycles for our norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin systems, which is why a lot of the brain areas I described, like the hippocampus, the HPA, the hypothalamus, amygdala, etc., have less brain area. They start to die off because of the overwhelming amount of cortisol. That's the theory. So what a lot of meds do, like antidepressants and SSRIs, SNRIs, and even things like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is they stimulate these regions of the brain, providing catecholamines, things like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. These things allow us to regenerate neuronal activity, basically. We get more serotonin in between the neurons talking and working and doing their job, which means the neurons activate more, which means we feel better, theoretically speaking. Now, this is a gross overgeneralization, but for the sake of our talk, it should work. So the same thing with like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. I know shock therapy sounds just horrible, but the reality is certain kinds of brain stimulation can actually help all the chemicals for brain growth, neuron growth, things like neurotrophin and BDNF. It can actually stimulate the activity of these chemicals and allow them to start functioning better and start to regrow and reconnect. And if we take a look at how talk therapy is supposed to work with regard to the brain, right? So when I sit down with a client and I do therapy or I do coaching or consulting or something, my goal is generally to help them feel understood and to try and kind of wade through the insanity of life with them. So in that experience of trying to help them feel understood, I'll reflect things and talk about what I'm hearing and give my reactions to things and try and explain and understand things with them. This process of explaining and understanding and reflecting and trying to get involved in their perspective on things allows them to feel seen and understood. And theoretically, that should feel good. That should elicit some kind of serotonin or norepinephrine response. If you laugh in therapy with someone, likely your play system is activated, in the words of Jaak Panksepp, which means that you're probably going to get a little bit of a norepinephrine and a dopamine and a serotonin boost, and maybe even a cannabinoid boost, which will again help you feel good. So I try to laugh a fair amount in therapy with people because again, life is ridiculous. And as you heard my humor talk, we need to have some humor to feel better, you know? So this is the basics of the brain, and I hope that generally makes sense to everyone. As my last post for the year, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's watched, everyone who has listened, all the feedback in the comments. And I think in the coming year, I'm going to do a lot of different kinds of talks that move away a little bit from, you know, the straight research on mental health topics like depression, anxiety, and fear. Again, with the book coming out, The Fear Problem, I probably am not going to drive any of those points home. I'm probably going to step more into social phenomenon. And if there are any topics that you want me to explore from the psychosocial perspective, let me know. But for now, I hope you have a safe New Year's. I hope that if you are doing the whole resolution thing, that you set reasonable goals for yourself, nothing extravagant or insane, because as the research shows, if you set a huge goal for yourself, you're just going to fall flat on your face. So set small, reasonable goals, be around people today, feel connected, have fun, and I look forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks in 2018. Have a good day.